Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Gregg Bendian, host of the ProgCast. We have a very special and very fascinating guest today. He is a multi-platinum and Grammy-winning producer, co-producer, engineer, and has been responsible for the sound on many records that I love and enjoy over the years, particularly his work with XTC, Phil Collins, Genesis, The Police, Sting, Peter Gabriel, and all of these are now viewed as classic recordings. And I'm so happy to be able to speak with the man who has put these sounds to tape and put them into the airwaves, into our ears. Hugh Padgham. Welcome, Hugh Padgham.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here.
Really great to see you. And I appreciate Andy Partridge hooking us up together so that we could get into some geekery. Although I won't, I don't know if I will go the full multi-hour distance with you, but we'll see if we can keep you interested.
Andy's great when he gets going, isn't he?
The best, yes. So you, Padgham, I'm curious about some of your early developmental years in terms of the kind of tutelage as a tape op, working into engineer, working into producer. What are some of your early memories of that? Because I had also read somewhere that you were tape op on a Gentle Giant recording. Is that true?
Yeah, it was. Yes, I started off soon after I left school in 1974, I think it was. I got a job as a tape op at a studio called Advision Studios, which was quite a well-known studio at the time. Sadly, it doesn't exist anymore, like many of them, but it was a pretty cool studio where Yes did all their albums with a guy called Eddie Offord, who I ended up working with later on in my career. But Gentle Giant, as in a lot of those studios in those days, there were other sessions like jingle sessions. And I remember, I think I tape-opped on a Mott the Hoople session. Well, I do remember that because something terrible happened in it.
What was that?
Well, they all got into a fight one day, and in those days, you used to drink cider, which in England is an alcoholic drink. I know in America it's like non-alcoholic, but in England it's always alcoholic. And they used to sell the cider in these great big glass bottles called flagons. They were probably about a bit bigger than the size of a wine bottle. Anyway, a bit of a fight got into action one night, and someone threw a cider bottle at somebody else, and they ducked, and it went into the control room window, which was about 10 foot long by 3 or 4 foot high, and broke it basically. And so myself and the engineer were hauled in front of the studio manager the next morning and told to explain ourselves. So that was, I've got other stories on that session as well, but I don't think we've got time to get into them. There was a lot of funny stuff going on in those days, and I worked with a band called The Sweet, that was a big pop band here, but probably not so well known in America. And jazz, a Japanese jazz guy called Stomu Yamashita. And yeah, and so it was a really cool studio. And one night I remember walking down to the loo, and in the loo was the several members of Joe Cocker's, it was called the Grease Band, Joe Cocker and the Grease Band, who were a great, fantastic band. And I walked into the loo, and there was one of the guys in the band was having a pee, and there was a girl standing there helping him have a pee. All sorts of things.
Well, you were in Rockland. You were in
It was quite a shock, actually. Quite a shock, because I was quite sort of I was not, it was my first taste of rock and roll, put it like that. I mean, I was at school, I went to a boarding school, no girls, I had quite a sort of, I wouldn't say sheltered, but it was quite a sort of, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Quite a sort of
proper,
yes, that's a good word, a proper sort of education. And when I was at school, and everybody was supposed to either be a lawyer or a fireman, or just something like that. And when I said to my careers officer that I wanted to work in a studio, he kind of laughed. And anyway, so I proved them all wrong, luckily. And so anyway, I wrote to loads and loads of studios. Funnily enough, my school, my boarding school that I went to was near Oxford, and just down the road from Oxford was the Manor Studios, which was Virgin's first studio that was made famous for recording Tubular Bells. And I knew that this studio existed, and I got on my bicycle one day and went and drove and rode it rather down there, and met the people from Virgin, and tried to sort of see if I could get a job there, of which there was not one going. But strangely enough, 5 years later, I guess it was, I ended up getting a job at Virgin, but there's a little bit to talk about between there. I got my job at Advision Studios, and then literally about 3 months later, I was made redundant because in 1974, we had a real problem with the politicians and the trade unions. And the trade unions made all the miners, because we still mined a lot of coal in those days, and made them go on strike for money and conditions and so on and so forth. And we had this really strange phenomenon in England that was called the 3-day week. And so you could only go to work 3 days a week, and depending on where you lived depended on which day you could go into work. And so the electricity was cut even, and all that sort of thing. And so the studios were quite affected. Our studio did get a generator in, but I think after the Mott the Hoople thing, I didn't really get on with the guy who ran the studio, and I think he was quite pleased to sort of lay me off, which he did. And so I was a bit upset about that. And luckily by that time, even though I'd only been working in the studio for a few months, I knew various other people who had jobs in other studios. And I particularly had a friend who was a maintenance engineer at Pi Studios, which doesn't exist anymore either. And he told me after a month or two of not working that there might be a job coming up at the studio called Lansdowne Studios, which was the second oldest independent studio in London. And it was started in 1955, I think. And so to cut a long story short, I got a job there also as a tape op, luckily just a few months later.
Could I ask you, what does one learn as a tape op? How does that prepare you for being a producer of music?
Well, first of all, I never aspired to be a producer at all in those days. All I wanted to do was, my highest aspiration was to become a recording engineer, and to become perhaps the chief recording engineer at one of the big studios in London. And it's so hard to, when I look back at that era now, people who worked in studios, engineers or producers, were gods. And all we had to do in those days, there were no computers, no mobile phones, no nothing. You either spent your money, when I was a teenager, on records or books if you were a bookworm, or you went to the cinema. And so, I learned about engineers and producers and stuff just from reading credits on the back of albums. And indeed, later on in my career, I would get jobs offered to me because people would have seen your name on the back of a record sleeve. So we knew all the names of the great musicians who played in, you know, whatever band it was, and the producer and so on and so forth, which I have to say I think is a real shame that information isn't available now, and it ought to be more easily available than it is. I mean, I love the fact that I can listen to any one of 42 million songs on Spotify instantly. Of course, we love that, but I think, you know, listening to records and having to listen to them in order of the songs in those days, and your favorite songs soon became your least favorite, and your least favorite became your favorite because you only had X amount of records to play, so you would play them to death, you know. But anyway, I'm digressing, aren't I?
Well,
I can't remember what you're saying now, but I think it's a shame actually, because just going back to the information on record sleeves, when CDs first came out, a lot of people were trying to get sort of, or even MP3s in iTunes and stuff. It's not that difficult to put what they call a metadata into the information. And you were lucky to get a little tiny picture the size of a postage stamp of the sleeve of the record. And indeed, I never liked CDs compared to vinyl LPs anyway, because the artwork was usually so small you needed a magnifying glass to look at it.
Well, we would become immersed in the cover art. So you'd be listening to the music and staring at the credits, staring at the colors, staring at that, and becoming, I think, drawn into a visual world of that sound.
Yeah, album covers to me were as memorable as the music. But now I remember what I was talking about. I never aspired to be a producer ever. And I remember actually at Advision in my early tape-op days, I did tape-op for about, I think it was 2 evenings on Elton John's album called, I think it was Captain Fantastic. It was the song that we worked on was Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, and I think that's the album it was on. Anyway, Gus Dudgeon came in as the producer, and he had these Ray-Ban glasses on, he had one of those leather coats with the patches on it, he had stacked heels. He was just the most godlike figure I had ever seen, and you just couldn't imagine yourself ever being a producer, even though he did come from the engineering side as well. But so I didn't aspire to anything other than becoming an engineer. So I got this job at Lansdowne Studios, which was a great studio, although after a year of 2 or 3 years of working there, I couldn't wait to get out. But the reason it was a great studio was because I got a very sort of formal education of recording there. And I was taken under the wing of the chief engineer, who was called John Maxwith. And that studio was set up by a guy called Dennis Preston, who was quite a well-known jazz producer, and it was originally set up as a jazz studio, and indeed jazz sessions used to go on there. But we also did pop sessions, rock sessions, jingle sessions, and those dreadful cover albums that used to come out in those days, where you covered the top 20, and you did the whole album in 3 days of songs. And it was incredible that they managed to copy Bohemian Rhapsody quite well amongst 15 other songs in 3 days. It was incredible. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I was taught how to put up microphones, how to mic things properly, how to record the levels on tape, why you use such and such a microphone for such and such a thing, and it was in all these different genres as well. So I think I had a really good, as I said just a minute ago, sort of quite a formal education, and we were told to read or advised that it would be good to read books. There's one called Sound Recording Practice that I've still got, and it would explain to you what nanowebers per meter was on tape and all that sort of thing. We were also taught how to line up analog tape machines and that sort of thing. So it was really, really good. But it got to the stage where I really knew that I could start doing engineering myself. And so I did get the odd vocal overdub session, which is usually what you do when you're first thrown in the deep end. And I was thrown in the deep end doing vocal overdub sessions with a guy called Roger Whittaker, who was famous for his whistling, and he was about as middle of the road as you could possibly get. And by this time I was thinking, actually, all I want to do is work with either rock bands or punk bands or whatever. I really don't want to go on doing jingles or string overdubs. That's right. The studio was well known for its string sound as well.
This is Lansdowne?
This is Lansdowne, yes.
I think that one of my favorite Camel records, The Snow Goose, was recorded there with strings.
Oh, probably, yeah. I mean, a lot of string. I can still mic up I haven't done it so much recently, but I used to, whenever we did string sessions anywhere after my period at Lansdowne, I was always hands-on with them because I'd sort of been taught how to do it. And so they all counted very well for the future. But anyway, having got sort of bit itchy feet at Lansdowne, I still had contact with people at Virgin. And so when I discovered that they were going to build another studio in London as a sister studio to the Manor, I got hold of the people in charge and persuaded them to interview me. And so I didn't really have much of an interview because I sort of knew them and they were hiring other people. And so I very luckily got a job at the Townhouse. In fact, before it was even finished. So we were all cajoled into actually soldering up mic panels as well, because as usual, everything was a bit late and stuff. So I'd also been taught at Lansdowne how to wield a soldering iron as well. So anyway, that was where my sort of what I call, the proper start of my career happened, really. And then the Townhouse Studios happened to just be the coolest place at the best time. So anybody sort of working there, we just had the best bands come in, and that's how I met Steve Lillywhite, who was exactly the same age as me, the young producer, and we did 2 XTC albums together, and also the Peter Gabriel's 3rd album. And through working with Peter, I met Phil Collins, and then because of the drum sound on Peter's record, that's how Phil asked me to do his solo record, and it all sort of went from there. And so I was, I guess, house engineer there for 78. I started, late 78, the studio opened, and I would have left in 81, I think.
So what's happening while you're there?
Sorry?
What sessions are happening while you're there?
Well, I mean, everything from XTC to Peter Gabriel to I did some sessions with Yes on the drama album.
What was that like? That's a very difficult period for them because they're losing Anderson and Wakeman, and they're bringing in two guys from the Buggles.
Yeah, well, I knew the Buggles guys because I was one of the quite a few people, I think, who mixed Video Killed the Radio Star.
Oh, was that a long, drawn out process?
Well, yes, because Trevor, who's a lovely guy, was mad as a hatter, really, and he just kept not being satisfied with this song that was, I mean, it's still a famous song now, I suppose, isn't it?
It is.
But I don't think anybody knows whether they mixed it or not, because he did so many different mixes with different people. So it's very difficult to know. But when I did got asked to do this stuff on drama, which, funny enough, Eddie Offord started to work on, who had produced their early stuff at Advision. I thought it was the most peculiar thing ever that the Buggles, who were a Buggles bubblegum type sort of pop act, would get together with one of the sort of most well-known prog acts. And weirdly enough, a few weeks ago, I was doing another interview for somebody, because everyone's obsessed with the 80s at the moment. And I listened to the album again, and I thought, oh my God, Trevor sounds exactly like John Anderson. And keyboard sounds a bit different and that sort of thing. But I thought, well, this isn't so stupid now. I look back on it so many years later. But anyway, so I did that, but I didn't really, I mean, I was just engineering, and it was all a bit weird, to be honest. There was a lot of weird, what I call rock star stroke Spinal Tap stuff going on. And I was extremely pleased when they decided to go off and mix it somewhere else, because Trevor Horn had got together with oh gosh, this lady who became his wife, who ran the label that had Frankie Goes to Hollywood on it and stuff. And her brother had a studio called Psalm Studios in London. And there ended up with two Psalm studios, Psalm East, which was that studio, and Psalm West, which was when they bought Chris Blackwell's Island Studios later on. Anyway, I keep digressing here, but I was so pleased that they went off and mixed it somewhere else, because it almost immediately I started working on Black Sea, XTC's next album, which had been booked in by, and Steve Lillywhite was producing that. So if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been able to have done Black Sea, which is a great album. But going back to other people, I mean, I did stuff on Spandau Ballet's first album. I did stuff with Kate Bush.
Oh, what did you do with Kate Bush?
Well, I did some tracks on the Dreaming album, Sat on Your Lap. I did all the backing tracks for that song. I think I did the backing tracks for 3 songs on that record.
That's one of my favorite records of all time. I would love to hear anything about that.
Oh, really? Well, she was determined to get me to work with her, because I'd met her when she came in to sing backing vocals on Peter Gabriel's record, and she was obsessed with Peter, and we all loved Kate as well, and she was lovely girl and stuff. And so anybody who had worked with Peter on his album, she wanted to work with me on mine. And it was also slightly weird, because I started doing weekends with her because I was working with somebody else. I can't remember who it was now, but and she wanted me to carry on working, but I had been asked in the meantime to do the Ghost in the Machine album with the Police, and asked to do it as sort of co-producing with them as well. And so I remember being really awkward, not wanting to tell Kate that there was somebody else that I would rather go off and work with than her, if you see what I mean. So that was a bit weird. Anyway, I did other sessions. I did things with Public Image. I did, funnily enough, I met the Sex Pistols when they were signed to Polydor Records for 2 days, I think, when I was at Lansdowne still, in 1976 or 7, whenever that would have been. And I did reggae artists. I'm sure there's loads of other bands I can think of that I did stuff where I mixed a song or two on one of the Jam albums. And it was great, the Townhouse in those days, because there were 2 studios, which later became 3. And there was always someone good in the other studio. And there was a canteen. So you'd always meet at lunch times or dinner times and chat. So, you know, you met so many people. I mean, I got to know Queen really well because they were in Studio 1 and I was invariably in Studio 2, which had this, you know, the famous stone room, and worked there a lot with Phil Collins and whoever else, and so I met and became quite friendly with Freddie Mercury and the rest of the band. But you know, I'd be walking down the corridor past their studio to go home, and Freddie would come out and see you and say, "Oh, come in and have a listen to our new record," and stuff like that. So you would go in and listen, and he'd pour you a gin and tonic and stuff like that. And it was really, really good fun, such good vibes. And I was just so lucky to be in the right place at the right time.
Do you remember what Queen were working on?
Oh, well, it would have been whatever albums they were, you know, it was after Bohemian Rhapsody. So it would have been 82 or 83. I did make a list the other day, and it looks like I hardly had any time off at all for, you know, 10 years sort of thing. Yeah. And I eventually left to go freelance after doing Face Value with Phil Collins, because 2 things. Firstly, they let me go off to America we went to LA to do some overdubs on that record. And they were a bit sort of, when I say they, was like the management at the studio were a bit sort of, oh, well, all right, because you started doing the record, we'll let you go and all that. But I wasn't allowed to take, you know, they said, well, we're going to sort of pay you, and if you get any more, you got to give it to us. And I was only on, oh God, I mean, it was something like less than, it would have been dollars wise about $200 a week or something. I mean, I know it's 40 years ago, but even then that wasn't very much money. You know, you could get at least that a day working freelance. So I made the decision to leave and go freelance, even though I went back there to work a lot. And it was great. And in those days, there weren't really that many producer engineers about. You asked me earlier about how I sort of got into production. And that's quite a funny story, because being an engineer, doing all these sessions at the Townhouse, I was very often sat next to a producer who I thought didn't know what the hell he was doing. And obviously some did, but others I thought, well, if that's what you call a producer, I can do that. And if I can do that and do the engineering, surely that's going to save bands a load of money, or at least something, you know. And so anyway, at that time, the Virgin Records was run by this really really good guy called Simon Draper, who was actually a cousin of Richard Branson's. He's a very, very, very nice man. And because Richard Branson didn't ever really run the label. In fact, he didn't really have that much interest in music, I don't think.
Really?
So, no, not really. I mean, it was for him, it was a way to make money, you know, selling records.
So is Draper signing all the proggy acts?
Yes. No, I don't think Richard signed anything. I mean, it was all Simon Draper or whoever else was A&Ring at the label. So I said to Simon Draper one day, do you think I could have a go at producing some of your junior acts? And so I think the very first one I did was an EP with Barry Andrews, who was the keyboard player in XTC on their first 2 records. And then I did a couple of other things. Nothing was massively a hit, but at least it gave me the opportunity to you know, to wet, you know, my whistle at doing that. Because to start with, actually, I did find it a little difficult to be able to do the engineering, because of course in those days it was all analog, so you're doing editing with razor blades and you've got to make sure the level on the tape's okay. And so to do all that, so looking at the VU meters or whatever, and to listen and go, well, that was a good take or that wasn't a good take or whatever. So it was quite good to get some experience doing a few of those sort of what I call junior bands. It's a bit mean to say that, isn't it? But and so therefore when eventually Phil Collins asked me to co-produce his first solo album with him, Face Value, I was much more sort of confident about it, even though I was still only 25 at the time. And it's so weird because I look back on it and I think that when I started at the Townhouse, aged sort of 23 or something, I'd been working for 4 years as a tape op, and that seemed like it was 40 years, and I couldn't wait. You know, I just thought, this is terrible. I've got to get on. You know, and so when I did Peter Gabriel's album, I was 24, and then doing Phil's record the next year, I was only 25. So it's amazing, really.
Amazing. And Phil started very young, so he couldn't have been too much older than you.
I think Phil's 4 years older than me. So if I was 25, he wouldn't have been 30 yet as well. And my God, I mean, when I got to work with Peter Gabriel, I mean, first of all, working with XTC, I loved their first albums as well. So to get to work with bands that you like is just, it's like, you know, it's like, you know, it's the best sort of thing in the world. I mean, I never ever thought my job was like work. It was like, I'm just doing a hobby that I'm lucky enough to do a hobby that I'm being paid for all the time. You know, it was incredible. I mean, not, you know, sometimes life was pretty hard. You know, you'd end up finishing with Yes at 4 o'clock in the morning or something, and you're supposed to be doing a jingle session at 9 the next morning or something. And we tried to do jingle sessions and that sort of thing to fill in the time, because album projects didn't usually happen till the afternoon. So there's people who are running the studio wanted to see if they could get into that market as well at that time, but it didn't last very long, luckily. And anyways, and so that's how I sort of ended up morphing into being producing and co-producing, by sort of partly luck, partly accident, and partly being in the right place at the right time.
Well, and also you had some ambition, clearly, to do more.
Oh yeah. And of course, in those days, when you engineered your first #1 album, you became extremely competitive with other engineers, not in a bad way, but you know, you knew who had engineered every record that came out in those days, English or American, and you knew who was on it and who had produced it and so on and so forth. So it was, you know, it was really cool to you know, to get onto that sort of ladder in a way.
Sure. Who were your favorite American producers?
Well, let me think.
Or records that you admired from that period that would influence your idea of quality and sound?
Well, I mean, my thing was I always loved the sort of American soul stuff, Stax and so on. I loved Motown. I loved American music more from a soul point of view. I think I thought that our bands were maybe not better, but more original or something like that. But I mean, I adored the Talking Heads, for instance, at that time. I think I remember Steve Lillywhite and myself plotting to see if we could somehow get hold of David Byrne and see if we could produce go and work on a Talking Heads record. But I don't know, gosh, I need to have lists in front of me to remember. I mean, I loved all the stuff growing up, the Beach Boys, you know, the Monkees even I loved as a teenager. And as we well know, they were written by fantastic artists and also played by great session men as well. I liked Phil Spector, but never really, it always sounded too messy. I respected him, and but didn't really like him. Oh, I tell you who I loved, all those bands like Little Feat and Ted Templeman, Russ Titleman. I loved Steely Dan, so I loved all those sort of bands. I loved Frank Zappa. I loved Captain Beefheart. I loved again I remember Andy talking about this, Tony Williams, Lifetime. I loved all those jazz rock type Return to Forever type bands. Mahavishnu Orchestra, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea. It was so weird because I loved all that stuff, but I also liked a lot of those sort of bands were very frowned upon once the punk thing started in the mid-70s here, and suddenly Led Zeppelin were sort of passé. I mean, Led Zeppelin were definitely my favorite band when I was growing up. I think their first record came out when I was 13, and it still means a lot to me now. Those first 4 Led Zeppelin albums, I think.
Iconic.
Absolutely, totally iconic. But working in the business, by the time of the mid to late 70s, they were really sort of has-beens, and the punk thing was such a big thing in England.
Was that a business thing, because I always felt that when we talk about the destruction of sort of early progressive or pop or original rock music, in replacing it with punk, what is that in the biz? I mean, you're there at that moment. I'd love to know your take on that, because I always thought it seemed short-sighted.
Well, I think looking back on it now, I mean, if you listen to the Sex Pistols, actually their first record that was done by, produced by, what's his name? Oh God, why is it always when I go onto podcasts or even worse, TV interviews, you always forget? Chris Thomas, that's it. who worked with the Beatles originally, and he did all sorts of wonderful stuff with Pink Floyd and God knows what else. But actually, you listen back to the Sex Pistols, and it's just rock music. It's just 12-bar blues rock music. Instead of somebody singing on it, they were screaming over it. And at the time, though, it seemed, and everybody thought this was such a new era. And when you look back on it now, it really wasn't at all. It was just, like trends go round in circles. And actually, it was just another way of joining up the same dots, really.
Well, weren't Led Zeppelin originally and Black Sabbath considered very grunge and very nasty?
Oh, well.
In the wake of the Beatles, in the wake of pop?
Well, when I was growing up, you were either a Beatles fan or a Rolling Stones fan. And I did used to dress up and get my mother's violin out and pretend I was Paul McCartney with his violin bass and stuff. And I didn't even know what a bass was in those days. But anyway, I had friends and we would pretend to be the Beatles. But actually, I secretly did prefer the Stones, even though I massively love and respect the Beatles. But I was a bit more sort of rebellious and therefore like the Rolling Stones and still revere their albums up until 1971, really. And what am I trying to say?
Well, I'm asking about that intersection of prog's on the way out, punk is coming in.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I get so bad. My brain is so frazzled now at my age that I seem to forget what I'm talking about half the time. I mean, I have to say, if I was working with certain bands, you would not necessarily say that I went to go and see Chick Corea play last night at Hammersmith Odeon or something, because they would go, that's bloody rubbish, all that stuff, But I always had a secret liking to it. But, funnily enough, Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols, his secret love was Van de Graaff Generator, which is one of England's proggiest bands, of which I liked as well. And funnily enough, about 10 years ago, I ended up mixing one of their records, which was rather good. And I was so interested in working with Peter Hamill and stuff, who's a lovely guy, that I did it for nothing other than a very token royalty. That was when I had my own studio, which sadly I haven't got anymore. But there was, I don't know, I just love, and going back to America, the whole sort of jazz scene, really, I revered as well. When I say jazz scene, I'm talking about, the Miles Davis or whatever going back before. And
well, it seems to me that your varied tastes, your varied interests set you up perfectly to work with someone like Phil Collins, who reveres the R&B, soul, Motown thing, and all the hardcore jazz rock fusion stuff of the moment. He's going to form Brand X. He's going to bring all the Weather Report influence into Genesis.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, I got all that, definitely.
He must have loved that about you.
Yeah. I mean, the one problem with working 16 hours a day in the studio is you didn't tend to go home and listen to records for the rest of the night. So I have a slight sort of disappointment in a way when I was listening to your podcast with Andy and Andy Partridge, this is, and he was talking about the hours spent on buses and stuff, listening to stuff. I felt rather sort of inferior in a way with what he was saying about stuff, because even though I have an amazing love of music, like I said, there's only 24 hours in a day, and if you're working on an album for 16 hours of those days, and I did throughout the 80s pretty well without a break, which I'm not complaining about at all, but it meant that I think my powers of listening were or my ability to listen to everybody's records. For instance, I don't really know Frank Zappa after 1980 or 81, I realized the other day. And the other thing that I don't know nearly enough about, which I'm trying to do, catching up a bit now, is films and things, because obviously in those days you had to go to the cinema to see films. I mean, there might have been the odd film on TV, but I'm quite sort of ignorant on a lot of, you know, films. There's a lot of great films, put it like this, that I haven't seen.
Well, same here. I mean, we're all catching up with the Criterion Collection. I don't know if you're a fan of that series, but all of the classic films remastered and with bonus materials, that's some way that I've been exploding, trying to get back into the whole, what you're saying, films you didn't see that you need to see.
Yeah. And nowadays I sit at home and I'm fascinated by history, politics, all sorts of things that I wasn't so fascinated in then, because I had a sort of what I call a one-track stereo in those days, which was just work. And then I adore this new thing of podcasts, because there are so many interesting podcasts out there on whatever subject you can care to think of, and I subscribe to about literally 30 podcasts, of which are regularly being updated. Some I listen to just 10 or 12 minute daily politics podcasts, which are good, but there's the other big interest in my life has been cars and motor racing and stuff. And indeed I used to part own a race car team and stuff as well in the late 80s and 90s.
Did you ever be on Top Gear?
I've never been on Top Gear. No, I haven't, sadly. But I love it.
I want to see you on. If you're racing, I want to see you on Top Gear.
Well, yes, no. So I used to spend, if I had weekends and stuff off, I used to go racing. I mean, not me driving, although I did do some driving, but the team I ended up having a part ownership with was like a proper professional team, which we used to get sponsorship from Japan mostly, actually, but race all around, halfway around the world as well, not just in the UK. But that's another story. So I'm saying that now, instead of being bored listening to the radio in the car, for instance, if I'm driving somewhere, I'd listen to podcasts all the time now, because there's just so much fascinating information out there.
There's no shortage of interesting podcasts. It's true.
Literally no shortage of it. So I still like to read the daily newspaper, you know, in the morning, but then. And then now we've got so many TV channels. There's always interesting music documentaries or other documentaries on as well. So I just find myself like a sponge trying to soak up all this information that's out there.
I was so curious. You mentioned film. Are you someone that connects sound or the musical production aspect of production with visuals at all?
Yeah, I do actually. I look at music as being sort of a bit like a rainbow spectrum, although it doesn't necessarily need to have the rainbow colors, but I do listen to music, or when I'm making a record, I have to, there can't be too many of the same colors in the same place, because that means you're not going to hear what's going on. So I very much, the top end, the high frequencies, the nowhere must there be sort of clashing going on. And so I look at it very much as sort of bands of sort of frequencies, and I make sure that things are not, encompassing other things in those frequencies and things. And I think, I don't know, I think perhaps some of the things that people like or have liked, I don't know, I hate talking about myself, is the sort of clarity of records. And I think on especially on working with Phil, especially in the early records, which were sort of less pop orientated, I think we were very much we used to have long chats about this sort of thing, and we didn't want to, the terrible old cliche, which is less is more, but it is true. It's very easy to make a record and put the kitchen sink on it, and it's very much harder to not have much on it, because what's there is going to be heard and therefore has to make sense with the few other things. And I think that's why in some ways three-piece bands are some of my favorite bands in the world as well, whether it be Cream or the Jam, I'm talking rock music here, or it's just the Police, obviously. It's so interesting that you can have a band with only 3 instruments going on and yet it sounds completely full. And
well, there's a lot you can do with the 3.
Yeah. I mean, I know there's things as overdubs and so on and so forth, but anyway, yes, I do see music. The awful thing is usually the last thing I listen to are the lyrics on any record. But I've got better at that now as well, because I mean, Bob Dylan's I'm a huge fan of Bob Dylan, and of course he is, to my mind, probably the best lyricist or one of the best lyricists ever. And so you can't listen to Bob Dylan without listening to the words. And I've got
all about
better.
The words with him. I mean,
but you could quote lyrics from hit records that I've made and I wouldn't recognize them probably. If you're playing sort of a game like Trivial Pursuits or something like that. And
well, how often do lyrics actually call out for you to understand and engage with them?
Well, I don't want to be dissing artists here, but I do think that I look back on the Beatles and stuff, and you think what amazing, I think some of their songs and lyrics and their songs were pretty amazing, and they were so young themselves at the time, in their early 20s. And I don't think it's an excuse for artists or bands nowadays to sort of say, oh, well, I'm only young, how do I know about life or whatever, when they're singing banal lyrics of I love you, you love me sort of thing. I think that's no excuse at all. But
I mean, that's sort of what lost me with punk. We weren't really going to get into concepts in the lyrics anymore. Characters, caricatures, places.
I know it was really just a sort of it was a knee-jerk reaction to the sort of over indulgence of sort of long-haired rock in a way, which could be just as bad lyrically as what we were just saying about punk in a way. The excesses of, I think it was just kids rebelling, wasn't it, really? And every generation has their own rebellious side to it, and so, you know, you can't change, and so I can't say I get on particularly with a lot of contemporary pop music I hear. There's a lot of good stuff around as well, but how do you hear it? And I don't really take notice of the charts anymore, to be honest. And I can't say I'm particularly interested in Taylor Swift's new remake of Fearless or something. I would much rather spend my time listening to something else, or catching up on some Captain Beefheart record that Andy mentioned the other day that I haven't heard for 30 years or something. So, I mean, you imagine how long it would take to listen to everything that's on Spotify.
But you pick your battles, you know. You mentioned Beefheart. I mean, there's certain people you go back to and you say, I really need to deal with that again. And Phil Collins' solo career and 80s Genesis is one of those areas for me, because by the time I got to the 80s, I was off in jazz world. I wanted to be a jazz drummer. I wanted to write for jazz bands. I wanted to play acoustic music. So I wasn't really contemporaneously experiencing Abacab and Face Value, even Invisible Touch, those kinds of things. But I've gone back to them and I find so many gems there, Hugh Padgham, and so many things, so many choices that you and the band made in the case of even Gabriel Solo 3 or the early Phil stuff that I missed out on. So that's the kind of thing that I go back to, right?
Yeah.
It's the 40th anniversary of Face Value this year.
Yes, I know, yeah. It makes me feel really old, that's the problem. But it seems, it does seem like yesterday, actually, to me. There's things I can really remember and some things I can't remember at all. But yeah, it doesn't seem that long ago to me. Well,
I'm struck by the amount of variety on Face Value. So I can, you know, following Phil, following Genesis up to that moment, and I had been following Genesis from a very early age, in fact, middle school, when I discovered Nursery Crime in the school library.
Yeah.
In about 1975, it would have been. And so I knew Phil's Brand X stuff, loved it. I knew all of the Genesis stuff. I saw them transitioning. I saw Wind and Weathering tour. My dad took me to that. Then the following year I saw, and then there were 3 at Madison Square Garden. And I was always into the fact that they could write a tune. You know, I never thought Brand X was the end of the world. I never thought Brand X was the answer to everything in a way either, nor were any of even Mahavishnu. But I liked bands that could sing and play. And so when I look at Face Value now and tracks like Droned that are on that, you know, so that are pointing more to his instrumental Brand X kind of leanings. And then I completely slept on the fact that Face Value was right around the time of Lennon's assassination, John Lennon.
Yeah, that's a day I remember very well.
Yeah. And that has come up on the podcast before, you know, where were you when John Lennon died? And I remember I was in psychology class in high school and my teacher was a fan and she was crying and we were saying, what's happening? And, you know, I remember that Phil did a tribute at the end of Face Value to Lennon. So you have Tomorrow Never Knows, And then as
Yeah.
the record's sort of fading away, he sings Over the Rainbow as a kind of tribute to him. And
Yeah.
I listened to that recently, and it really knocked me out.
Mm.
And
We always like doing covers.
well, yeah, and there's certainly, I mean, that's a great one. That's a great cover to do. But then there's all the R&B stuff on the record. In the Air Tonight, in a way, I think it's almost like a new format. I don't even know what you would call that.
No, I
What
don't
is it?
think
It's
we
a rock
did.
song. It's a pop song. It's an ambient vibe. It's in some ways.
I know. But you know, the thing is, when we did that record, Phil had no idea that there was a big career in front of him. And we were doing it purely from a musician's point of view. He just said, look, I've written these songs that aren't going to suit Genesis. I don't even know what my position with Genesis is at the moment, because he was considering moving to Canada because his wife, they had split up and she had gone to live in Canada with their 2 kids. And so he was going, well, I can't, I got to put my family before the band. So there was a serious time when he was considering leaving Genesis then and going off to live in Canada. And if you're going to go and live somewhere, well, then, you might as well do solo record. But he had already written these songs, and I can't remember exactly when he decided that he wasn't going to go and live in Canada, but he'd written these songs that were, as far as he was concerned, weren't suitable for Genesis. He'd written them on a lot of them on the piano, and he's the first to profess that he can't, he's completely self-taught on the piano. So he's nothing like as good a keyboard player as Tony Banks in Genesis is, but he said, I want to play the piano. And of course, I want to play the piano on these songs because they're my songs and they mean a lot to me. And the thing with Genesis is that everything was very compartmentalized, in the sense that Tony would not have allowed Phil to play keyboards, and nor would Tony have played the drums. Not that I think that he can play the drums anyway, but do you see what I mean? So it was a kind of, although Genesis is like a family and they loved each other, and they still do, as they seem to be going out on tour again, it was a real release for Phil to be able to do something different, and to be able to do instrumentals, and to be able to bring his jazz thing out, and then the horns thing, because he loved Earth, Wind and Fire. I loved Earth, Wind and Fire as well. But also we were quite naive. It was funny that we didn't really realize in those days that horns for the most part meant black music, and so there was still an amazing sort of amount of, I don't know if segregation isn't the right word, but well, it was really. And I mean, yeah, white pop radio stations did not really want to play pop music that had horn section on it that sounded like Earth, Wind and Fire. I mean, I remember that, being explained this by somebody around the time after we'd recorded that. I mean, obviously it's sort of different now, but we had no idea. We were sort of rather naive to the whole sort of black versus white music thing. And indeed, when we were recording the horns for the first time at in LA at the studio, what's it called? My mind's gone again. The Village in Santa Monica, which was a fantastic studio. And one night, Maurice White came down to see what was going on. We thought he was coming down to meet us and have a little get together, but he wasn't really doing that at all. He was coming down to suss us out, and he did not like his horn section working on some white honky's little record,
I believe it.
Yeah, It was really weird, actually. And I remember after he'd gone and everybody else had gone, Phil and I were like going, Christ, what was that? You know, it was really weird.
You know, it's interesting you're talking about the cusp of 80 to 81 and radio probably being pretty segregated at that time. And yeah, it kind of still is. Although I don't know that radio plays as big a role at all now in terms of dissemination of music.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, don't forget, back in 79, 80, I don't think sort of hip hop or whatever, you know, genres related to that even really existed then. I remember being absolutely amazed when we first heard Grandmaster Flash and The Message, which gave Phil the idea of doing that laugh in Mama.
It's a great.
And I was the one who played him that record because I'd heard it and was like completely freaked out by it. And that was one of the first sort of records like that, wasn't it? I think
it's viewed as one of the first of that genre, yeah.
And yet that doesn't seem that long ago to me. And now you listen to everything. And we were also using drum machines that were had really only sort of just come out.
You're talking about Linn drums? What specifically?
Well, yes, or even on In the Air Tonight was a Roland CR78, and I think that was the first Roland programmable drum machine, I think. And we used a thing called a Paya on Peter Gabriel, not very much, but that was one of the very earliest. You could only buy it as a kit, and it was called a Paya drum box or drum machine or something.
Spelled how?
P-A-I-A. It's a Paya 1 or a 2, I think it was. If you look it up, if you Google drum machines.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Peter.
And you know the first record ever with a drum machine on it, which was way before that even, was Sly and the Family Stone.
There's a riot going on?
Exactly. That apparently Barry Gibb had the very, very first song with a drum machine on it ever, which I don't know if I've ever heard. But the first one that was a real hit on a rock record anyway was There's a Riot Going On, Sly and the Family Stone, and I think it was called a Maestro Rhythm King. I think. And I only know this because I did an interview recently with a guy who is writing a book on drum machines.
Well, that's interesting too, because you were so involved with Phil, Peter, and Genesis with drum machines. I was very curious. They seemed so keen to jump into that area. Where was that coming from?
It was coming. I think it was just coming from any piece of equipment, whether it be a keyboard, a drum machine, or whatever. Anything that came out, we wanted, or studio bit of gear, we wanted a bit of it to check it out, what it was, and anything, literally anything, we would, get and therefore try and do something with, I suppose.
But drum machines become a big part of Genesis sound, don't they?
Well, they do really, yes. Whether it be Linn drums or emulator drum kits, emus, whatever they were called, and the Linn 9000, and then the famous one which everybody can't get enough of now is the 808, isn't it? Which was the TR-808, which was the one that came after the CR-78.
So how involved were you with the drum programming aspect of things as an engineer? Were you concerned about sounds? Were you saying yes, no, maybe in these situations as a producer?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, working with Phil, for instance, who loved his drum machines. I mean, he fiddled around with them so much. He was the one who would usually come up with a pattern and usually probably within the writing of the song. We didn't write songs in the same way as Genesis, which were kind of written in rehearsals, again with mucking around with drum machines. He would tend to come into the studio with a song fairly well sorted, which often meant a drum machine part, which would then, the one thing he wouldn't do on his demos is play drums particularly, because, you know, how do you do that at home yourself, sort of thing. And so, I mean, on In the Air Tonight, we just knew we wanted to put drums on it at some point, but we didn't really know where at that point. And we just loved the idea of sort of shocking people into thinking after what would normally be the end of a song, let's just whack these drums in at the end. And that was the story of that. But the that CR78 drum pattern, we could never recreate in the studio. And that's where we got the idea to use the demos as the actual record, because he had recorded that. He had an 8-track 1-inch recorder at home, thank God, rather than just a cassette or something, because we were able to transfer that sound to the 24-track and then overdub it from there. So that and the Prophet sound on that is second generation, because we could never get the sound to sound the same. And I think that's a thing as a producer that you have to sometimes realize is it's better to have the vibe than the sound.
Yes.
Much better to have a crappy sounding record that's got the best vibe in the world on it, the best groove, rather than something that's really well recorded but doesn't get you going at all. And so I think that's a very important thing that I learned on
Great example. That's a great example of knowing when the vibe overrides a technical issue.
Yeah.
Like a slight pitch issue in the vocal, but is it the performance that you want?
Yeah, exactly. And we had this saying for a long time, which was chase the demo. So many times in the studio, the demo sounded best, and sometimes you literally couldn't use it if it was recorded on a micro, you know, like a voice, you know, memo recorder or something like that. But I mean, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic was from the Police. That was recorded onto a demo because we just couldn't get a vibe going the same.
That's a demo.
It is, but with Stuart and Andy overdubbing onto it. But the original demo was Sting and this guy called Jean Roussel, piano player, who, you know, from Cat Stevens and all that, who recorded it with Sting in the studio when he was doing other demos. Jean just happened to be there, and they worked out the song and played it. Made the demo, and we could never get the band to sound like it. So in the end, we or I or all of us decided just to overdub everything else onto it, which was a remarkable thing to be able to do, because I don't believe there was even a proper, like a click on it or anything like that. So that was I mean, we're jumping around a bit here, but that was a real pressure recording.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you are literally at the end of your nerves trying to make records in the studio where you know there's something magical about this song, but it ain't sounding magic coming out of the speakers at the moment or whatever, you know. And so it's not all fun and games all the time.
No, in fact, it's work. Quite literally, it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of sweat. It's a lot of hours. And, you know, I Malcolm Cecil, who we spoke about before we went on air, told me the story of putting in hours and hours and hours with Jeff Beck recording Superstition, because Superstition was a gift from Stevie Wonder to Jeff Beck before it was Stevie Wonder's song.
Oh, I didn't ever know that.
Yeah. So Malcolm shows up and makes delivery to Clive Davis at that time, was the exec. And right as that happens, Berry Gordy says, your Jeff Beck can't have this song. It's a hit. Stevie Wonder's going to record it for Tamla. And Malcolm was literally screwed. In fact, Clive Davis threw the invoices back at Malcolm and said, "What's the one job of a producer? Delivery." And he didn't care and stuck him with, like 5 figures of bills and things like that. So, yeah, we know the twists and turns of it can be really rough. I really wanted to speak with you about drums. As a drummer, so many of us view you as one of the guys that helped liberate the sound of drums in rock and pop music. And I'm also fascinated by this period of time where multiple bands are doing cymbal-less drum sound. And you're at the center of so many of these projects. I understand about the Stone Room not really tolerating a lot of white noise with the drum sound, and I understand cymbals being white noise generators. But I guess, what is the aesthetic? And I have a take on this, and I'd love to know what you think, but does it start with Black Sea Travels in Neolon? Does it start with Peter saying no drum, no cymbals? And if so, is Peter sort of making a reference to the world music he'd be listening to, the African drumming and the Eastern stuff that really doesn't have cymbals in it?
Well, let's see. First of all, the sound of the drums in that room, we had recorded with XTC on drums and wires. First. So that room came first. And the thing is with the Peter Gabriel sound is that, well, I say the Peter Gabriel sound, the gated drum sound, is that came during Peter's record from the Listen mic, which was on the SSL. And the Listen mic had much higher compression than we had ever put on the room mics in the recording of particularly drums and wires before, because I had realized that the more you compress it, the bigger it sort of sounds, the room sounds, but the cymbals just take over. They take over. But so then going on to Peter's third record, I spoke to him the other day, about something else. And I said to him, because this question comes up quite a lot. So I said to him, where did you get the idea for like, no, why did you say, because I remember really, really well, I remember him coming in on the first day and saying, I don't want any cymbals or hi-hats on this record. And he said, I promise you, it just popped into my brain that day. He said, I swear to God, it hasn't come from any deep thought or anything. So that's what Peter said. And if he hadn't said that, he is as responsible for that drum sound as much as I am, or Phil is, or Steve Lillywhite, or anyone. Because if he hadn't said that, that huge compression, which is what it's all about, you wouldn't have been able to do. And you certainly wouldn't have been able to do the gating, because the cymbals carry on decaying much longer than most drums, even tom-toms.
And let me ask you, had Phil or Peter heard the XTC stuff?
Well, I think Peter had, because that was one reason why he had asked Steve to get involved in it, because he liked that. And Drums and Wires was probably the first XTC record that kind of did come to everybody's attention. And Steve and I had done a song called Life Begins at the Hop before we did Drums and Wires as well. And that was a sort of like a minor hit here. And so, yes, I think XTC was definitely one part responsible for us ending up working with Peter. And XTC was responsible for me working with the Police, because they toured with the Police quite a lot in those days. And one day they're on the bus and Sting says to Andy, "Oh, we need to get somebody else to make our next record. You know, we want another producer," and so on and so forth. Who do you reckon? And he suggested me. And that's how I got to work with the Police. And I'd actually already met Sting once, because he came down to the Townhouse to do a demo, because at one point he was actually signed to Virgin Music himself for a short while, but he had a huge falling out with Virgin and left.
Was Phil Collins a fan of Terry Chambers drumming?
I never remember him saying that. I would say probably
forward music, you know.
I don't think I doubt if Phil knew XTC that well, to be honest. Partly because he's always busy on his own stuff, i.e. Genesis in those days, and or Brand X, and or drumming with John Martin, and or doing sessions for somebody else. So I don't know without asking him, but I wouldn't have thought that he would have been particularly aware of XTC, and I don't remember us ever having the, a discussion about it.
How was Gabriel 3 Melt put together in the studio, you?
Well, we started off actually working on a mobile studio, the Manor Mobile, down in a barn next to a house that Peter used to rent near Bath. And it was kind of, if I remember, it was sort of autumn time, the fall time stroke winter. And Jerry Marotta was on those sessions, and Larry Fast, and Peter had the bones of some of the songs. So I remember doing backing tracks there, and then we carried on doing quite a lot of the rest of the album at the Townhouse. And for those days, it took a long time to make that record. I mean, we had one or two breaks in it, but it was over a year, and that was quite a long time. You know, I was used to making records in a few weeks, if that sometimes. So to take a year was a long time. But as I said, there were breaks in it. But all the idea to get Phil to come in and play drums on some of those songs was obviously overdubbed in the Stone Room at the Townhouse. Do you know, it's weird. It was quite a sort of engineering wind up a lot of the time, because we were only on 24 tracks. There was definitely only 24 tracks, and Peter was always wanting to try new ideas and things like that. And so it was quite nail-biting at times to know where to put things, and keeping track of where things were, and other versions of songs, I think it was. And so I was really pretty sort of involved with, it was probably definitely the most complicated record from an engineering point of view I have done. but also, my hero growing up production-wise were those early Elton John records with the Tumbleweed Connection and Madman Across the Water with Gus Dudgeon producing, and I thought his records always sounded so great and in your face and not too busy. And I don't know, I was very naive then from a production point of view, but when I was working with the Peter record, I was obsessed. We were all obsessed, I think, with getting great sounds, and so therefore it was, scary to keep having to, try all these things and keep things, and I didn't want to copy, or bounce things too much to lose generations and all that sort of thing. But it still sounds pretty good today, that record, I think.
It's a great sounding record. I have so many questions about it, but I'll just try to highlight a couple. What was it like getting vocal takes from Peter Gabriel at that point? Were the last step was the vocals?
Yeah, nearly most of the time, as far as I can remember, because the thing with Peter is he's the most lovable person in the whole wide world, but he's quite difficult to make his mind up on things, and therefore he would procrastinate about vocals, not vocals, but the lyrics a lot. And so I think we would, come on, Peter, you've got to, we've got to try and finish this song or whatever. But when he actually sang, I mean, he was brilliant in front of the microphone, so to speak, and microphone technique. And of course, in those days, we were using harmonizer a lot. There was usually some sort of effect on the voice.
Did you do like a pig nose amp thing at one point on his voice?
Yeah. That was more this thing called, we called it a 999, which was a Radio Shack little speaker and amplifier about the size of a big matchbox, which was used for just sort of testing audio signals, I think. Was it Radio Shack in America, or did you call it Tandy?
Radio Shack.
Okay, I think in England it was called Tandy, but Larry Fast had this little box, and we soon discovered that it sounded, anything you put into it sounded really distorted, but a really nice analog distortion. So lots of stuff on that album ended up going through this box that you just mic up with a SM57 in front of it.
I know everyone wants to ask you. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, it was nicknamed 9.95 because it cost $9.95.
Well, it sounded great.
Yeah.
My favorite track on that record is No Self-Control.
Oh yeah, I love that too.
Right, and so there are a few things on there that I just adore, and one of them is marimba playing by percussionist from Scotland, Maurice Pert.
Yeah.
Love Maurice Pert. He's a great composer. A lot of people don't realize he's a composer. Any recollections of Maurice Pert? Because I just do so adore him.
Well, yeah, funny enough, I was thinking about this the other day, and I'm trying to think who knew Maurice and why we knew Maurice, but I think
he was in Brand X with Phil.
Oh, he was. Okay, I was going to say, did he come from Phil? Okay. Well, yeah, Maurice is lovely, but I don't remember very much other than he came in and that part was probably worked out, I think. Yeah. And Maurice was so good that he would just play it and that was it. It was probably a 3-hour session job, So I don't remember a huge amount. And I don't think I've seen Maurice Pert ever since then.
Well, he passed a few years ago.
Did he now? Yeah.
Yeah. And then Dave Gregory also played on those sessions, couple tunes.
Yes, he did. Well, obviously, we meaning Steve and I, imported Dave because of XTC, because Dave just, he amazed us so much with his ability to play guitar. And I think we also had, what's his name from the Jam, come in for a song as well to play. Paul Weller, that's his name.
Oh, okay, yeah, know the name.
Paul Weller, and he turned up to play his session. He didn't bring a guitar or an amp or anything. He said, "Well, I didn't know. I've never done a session before. Thought you'd provide all that stuff."
Well, who got him?
They were in the other studio. They were in Studio 1 at the time. We were in Studio 2, and the Jam were angry young men sort of band. But I mean, they're very, very talented band, and he was extremely talented, and he had a real aggressive style of guitar playing, which was great. And so that's how he came in. But I think he only played on one song, of which I can't remember what it is without looking it up.
Do you have any recollection of Ahmet Ertegun hating that record and not wanting to put it out?
What, Peter's record?
Yes.
Yeah, Peter Gabriel's record. Well, I never, Ahmet never came to the studio when we were doing it, but we were aware that Atlantic decided they didn't want to put it out. They didn't like it. Because I think they just wanted 10 versions of Salisbury Hill, and they had no idea that we were sort of trying to be experimental and stuff like that. And I suppose Peter didn't have that sort of reputation like he does today in that sense. And so I remember the person who did used to come down was John Kolodner. And he was the guy who was the sort of the Atlantic Records guy that we dealt with. Even though he lived in America, he used to come over. Do you know who John Kolodner was?
I don't.
Okay, well, he was, I think, responsible for signing Foreigner and bands like that. And so he was like, he couldn't understand what we were doing. He couldn't understand it. And we had these weird instruments and things going along, and he would come in and say, well, hey guys, why don't you try a Prophet? Because they use Prophet now in Foreigner all the time. And so he was sort of really unhelpful, I think. And I think it was him that was the seed that made that happen. And the ironical thing is that Peter ended up going to oh God, where's my brain gone again? You must edit these things out. His record label became he's a real impresario, film impresario, David Geffen. So, okay, edit the last bit out. So, yep. The ironical thing about John Kolodner was that Peter ended up at Geffen Records, and who should end up as head of A&R at Geffen Records but John Kolodner. So that was quite funny. But I think it came out in America on Mercury, I think, that album, which was I think decidedly a sort of regarded as a second-rate label, I think. But yes, so the answer to that question is I think it all came from John Kolodner, but probably backed up by Ahmet as well. I mean, the first time I ever met Ahmet was in Sterling Sound, cutting Phil's Face Value, and he was the one who listened to In the Air Tonight and said, hey, I really like the song, but it's got no beat to it. I can't work out where the beat is. And he, I don't know if you know, but the single version of it that was released, probably
I just
most
listened to it.
had this drum pattern that was giving the feeling of a backbeat on it.
On Tom's, though, right?
Yeah, it was on Tom's, and so we were pretty devastated, as you can imagine. Actually, Peter, Gabriel, we were all devastated when we heard that Atlantic. You know, we'd put all this work into that record, and suddenly they didn't like it. It's like, what the fuck, you know? This is like unbelievable, and we were all really, really deflated. And then you go, well, maybe it is rubbish, you know, and you know, if they don't like it and all that. Anyway, going back to Phil's record, we were cutting the record, and he suggested, you know, putting I think you need to put a backbeat on it, and we were like, oh no, but we thought, well, Armit, we can't, you know, diss the boss of the record label. So we went back to England, and we went to a studio, 10cc's studio actually, and we put so much into this record that we thought, we can't remix it again or anything like that, but we've got to make Armit happy. So we got the master tape, and we put it into the desk, and Phil overdubbed those toms, and we just literally recorded it back onto another 2-track. So it's like the master tape with an overdub on it. So we didn't do any remixing on it at all. And I think, you know, it only really ever got played on the radio, I think, because DJs preferred the album version. And I think the one with the drum, the tom overdubs, was, I think, the single here and in America officially, but DJs played the album version.
I hadn't heard the single version until recently, and it does not help that much for the cause to have those overdub backbeat tom things, because it sort of removes the surprise of the later event. So
yeah, exactly. And so we had to try and keep it as sort of quiet as possible, but to sort of try and do what Armit had asked us to do, I suppose. But we didn't do it particularly willingly, if that makes sense.
You know, what's another great tom-tom moment, though, which I just mentioned, No Self-Control. I mean, I love the tom breaking In the Air Tonight, but coming out of the bridge in No Self-Control, when Phil is just like slamming into those open bottom toms.
Yeah, it's great, wasn't it?
Man.
Yeah.
That's the Stone Room?
Yeah. All his songs. There was 3 songs that he played on, wasn't there? Intruder, No Self-Control.
Is he on I Don't Remember?
Yes, I think so. Gosh, I ought to remember these things.
But yeah, I mean, we loved that Phil had brought the Billy Cobham sort of slicing, smashing tom sound, you know, into pop music, and that these are just such great moments. And so you would just mic those up the wazoo in addition to having the room?
Yeah, I mic'd them all up closely, as well as the room. But the room, I suppose the room probably ended up being 60-70% of it. Same as In the Air Tonight, really. And you would just use the close mics as a sort of what I call a pinpoint, just to have the stick attack on it. Same with the snare drum, really. And
did you EQ them?
Yeah, probably a bit. But I used to put one mic between 2 toms, because he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 toms, I think it was. And the top 2 were like, you couldn't mic them separately because they were so small. So I just used,
like 6, 8, 10. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess. So I just used to put one mic between the 2 toms, Do you see what I mean? So one mic for these toms. So you've got two toms and then one mic looking down at them both.
57s?
I used to use Sennheiser 421s, I think. Yeah, mostly those. And then same with the floor toms. The one drum that I did used to use more in the mix than well, obviously you couldn't adjust the mix of the room mics, but I used to use more of the close bass drum sound because you didn't get enough thud off the room mics.
But that was open also, right?
That was open. It was quite a lot of our sort of routine to take the front head off the bass drum in those days, even probably with XTC and stuff as well, because in the sort of rock idiom, I always thought you needed a tight, punchy bass drum.
Yeah.
To complement the bottom end with the bass guitar and stuff, and it was just, you know, to me it was much more of a jazz thing to have the front head on. And the other thing with Phil is that he always played on a 20-inch bass drum, whereas most people would have a 22-inch bass drum, and you got a bit more of a sort of less resonant sound to the smaller drum, I think. And,
but also less on a 20, less lows. So I tend to roll off mids and crank the lows on a 20 and then get that attack on the highs.
Yes. And then occasionally we would mic the drums from underneath as well.
Oh, so that's what I was asking you. So in the open and bottom toms, were you going interior as well as attack side and room? So would it have been 3?
Yeah. Well, I still sometimes mic, even with the 2 heads, I sometimes will mic the floor toms underneath as well, because you get more sort of bottom end out of them. Floor toms can be right bastards to record, really. Yeah.
It's so true.
For some reason, I don't know, but the one thing is we never used to spend very long getting a drum sound, though. That was for sure, because, and I was very much into not taking very long, because I thought it's very unnatural for drummers to sort of sit there. Can you play a snare drum for the next half an hour, please, so I get a snare drum sound? You know, for me, I just used to set the drum kit up and get them. Can you just loosen up a bit by just playing a bit of everything? And I would spend 5 or 10 minutes, or hopefully not even 10, but 5 minutes having already got my assistant engineer to probably just get vague levels before Phil went near the drum kit, or whoever's drumming goes near the drum kit. So I'm not having to spend half an hour, you know, finding mic levels and things. And then it's so much more natural to get a drum sound while someone's playing it all, you know, whereas if you just play one instrument at a time.
Are you really going to hit it that way?
Yeah, exactly. So I just used to try and spend as little time as possible, you know, getting a drum sound. And I might then say, oh, can you just go around the toms, bing, dong, 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 just so I can get, because I'm probably recording them onto a stereo track, so I can just get some vague idea of the pan position and level. Because especially in those days on 24 tracks, you couldn't record drums on. I mean, now with Pro Tools, you can record as many tracks as you like, but we, you know, I didn't want to record the drums on more than 6 or 7 tracks, really, if it didn't have to, because you know, otherwise where were you going to record everything else, you know? And
Did you bounce and sum up on drums frequently in those days?
no, hardly ever. I was obsessed about not having to do that. So I would just record bass drum on one track, snare drum on another, hi-hat probably, although
No
hi-hat,
top bottom,
I would always mic the hi-hat on the top.
but snare drum top only, not bottom.
No, I never really liked miking underneath unless I really, really had to. But even then in those days, if you had to, you would have to mix it together. You couldn't afford another track. And therefore, I didn't ever really like, to me, if you couldn't get a good drum sound with a mic on the top, then maybe a snare sound. I mean, I'd rather try another snare if possible. Again, it's all down to the best drummers have the best sound, but give you the best sound. They've got the best, they know how to tune their drums and so on. It's only when you're struggling with people who can't really play very well that you end up, for me anyway, having to, mic underneath or whatever. But, and then toms on a stereo pair, overheads on a stereo pair, and then if you were lucky, your room sound on a stereo pair. So that was 9 tracks even then. And the one I would most likely lose would be the hi-hat if I had to, because normally it usually comes over on the overheads pretty well if you've recorded them hopefully well. But again, it depends on how loud he's playing the hi-hat or the actual, what the little cymbals are and so on. But yeah, so that was
one other thing about the Gabriel 3. How did it come about, like the next Gabriel record, to be released in German?
Oh, well, no, that was the same record, but he just overdubbed it in German, didn't he?
Well, I had read somewhere that there were parts that weren't the same and that there were tracks that were redone. Is this possible?
Oh, God. Well, I don't know. To be honest, I never had anything to do with the German record.
Oh, you didn't track the German vocals?
No. He went to Germany and I think he did it with an interpreter and stuff. I mean, I was well gone. I'm looking at my list here. I was well gone and doing.
Because I always wondered why that was important, especially 2 records, not just 1 record. The next record as well, he did Security in German. Was there a huge need, an audience in Germany for him that he was either aware of or pursuing?
Well, I think that would have been one reason, but I don't think it would have been the main reason. I think he just liked the sound of the guttural language.
Okay. That's very Gabriel then, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there was ever I mean, I remember doing one of Sting's songs in Spanish because the record company, the Spanish market, especially in South America, is so enormous. I think the record company were going, oh, well, let's see if we can have a hit in South America or something. And that was probably done on a more mercenary basis. But I think the Peters thing was more just I think he liked the guttural sound of the German language, but I certainly never had anything to do with it. No. And so I don't know. Do you know what? I ought to listen to it at some point, or just to see, because it must have been remixed then.
Yes, and I listened to it. It's on Spotify, and it sounds like a different mix, and it sounds like there are a few different moments, edit points, etc.
Well, there probably would be. I mean, we've spent quite a long time mixing it. But what I will do at some point, for my own inquisitiveness, and I could also let you know, is Peter's the one guy from Genesis who I talk to the most, really. I also keep up with Mike Rutherford a bit, but I even play tennis with Peter, so I can ask him questions. But he has a guy who's been his own sort of personal engineer for like 30 years, if not 35, who's called Dickie Chappell. And Dickie, obviously, if you've worked with someone for that long, knows a lot. And Peter also has a huge archive of everything that he's done, not only, you know, musically, equipment archive. He's trying to get an audio archive together, so at some point he actually wants to chat to me to go on tape to add to his archive. I mean, one day there will be literally the you know, a bit like Pink Floyd have got very good archives and stuff. There will be the most incredible Peter Gabriel archive that will be immensely important to the history of contemporary music, really. And it's great that these sort of things are being done, I think, because it's important. It's important.
Have you seen the Neil Young archive?
No, I haven't. I've heard about it.
It's massive. It's incredibly well executed, very clear, very user-friendly, and he has it open online.
It is open. I thought it was. And can you get these mixes down on higher quality mixes? Because he was involved in this Pocono or Poco something, wasn't it? This player that unfortunately didn't really take off. But none of those players have really, have they?
No, but he is very set on making, you know, that sound contribution. So that's on there.
Yes.
Yeah, anybody that has that amount of a career, we'd love to see a Gabriel archive like that. But yeah, I say check out the Neil Young one because it's quite a nice model.
Yes, I would like to see that, and I'm absolutely sure that he would know about it as well. But I think it's great that artists can take, you know, that sort of thing so seriously.
What were the keyboard sounds on Games Without Frontiers? And did you whistle on that track?
Yes, I did.
You have quite a whistling discography, I think.
Well, a little bit, yeah. But the brilliant thing about that is, without sounding mercenary again, in England, as opposed to America, producers are now regarded as a performer, and you get originally was worded in the old days as a conductor, a producer. So they took from classical music. I'm talking about collection agencies here, and we are able to collect from any radio plays or phonographic plays, radios, streams, jukeboxes, anything like that. And they amended, this was a European directive that came out about 16 years ago now, where a producer was regarded the same as a conductor now, and therefore we were. It's called you're called a non-featured performer. So the artist is a featured performer, and the producer is a non-featured performer. The engineer is nothing, and in America, the producer doesn't get anything like that as well. Sadly for Americans, but so now I am, because I'm on the cover, credited as a whistler. I now earn a little bit of money from that whistling session, which is great. But if you think about all the hits that Hal Blaine was on, that he only ever got paid $30 a session for or whatever, and it's been played like You've Lost That Loving Feeling or something more times than you know anybody's ever had hot dinners. He would be a wealthy man, you know.
Well, the whole Wrecking Crew, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anyway, we're getting into the politics of music now, which is a different thing. But yes, so yes, I have done the odd whistle and the odd thing. And you know, funnily enough, just for a laugh, I used to try and do something on every record, just for not because this whole PPL, which is our payment collection agency here, not because of that at all, because no one had ever heard of, you know, there was no thing of that then. It was more just a laugh and you never asked for a credit or anything, playing you know, hitting a tambourine on the offbeat. Any bugger could do that, really, but you just did it because it was fun to just think that I played something on that record, you know. And of course, it was only the records that you actually got a credit on that Andy or Peter Gabriel were kind enough to do, that has allowed us to participate, as they say.
Well, we have a few more minutes. I wanted to sort of circle back to something you mentioned, which was working on Kate Bush, The Dreaming. And it strikes me that it fits in with those recordings of cymballess drumming. And you worked on Sat in Your Lap, which has the Hugh Padgham, Steve Lillywhite drum sound on it.
Yeah.
How was that recorded?
Well, exactly the same way. So yeah, she, you know, it had to get that sound. You really had to use that room pretty well. So especially at that time, because there were so few studios that had sort of really live. Actually, do you know what? The room itself wasn't as live as you think it was, and it wasn't even as big as you think it was. It was just the acoustic of these. It had tall walls, and they were all. They had these stone blocks on them, about 1 foot. They were not blocks. They were, you know, rocks. They were dug out of the ground from the Manor Studios.
Oh, they were. Oh. Yeah.
But do you remember how Eastlake or Westlake Studios used to look in the control room? So you would have the. Do you know who I mean by Westlake? They were like they used to, you know, make studios, and their big thing was they had these soffit mounted monitors in front of the console, and then they had these like a stone sort of area next to it, and then behind was the sort of cork and shag pile carpet on the wall, as it used to be. And so that's, it was this, basically it's like a limestone that was not flat at all, but the rocks were like I said, about 1 foot round or square, and we just literally concreted them onto the wall. So there was no, apart from the floor, which had flagstones on it, there was no flat reflective surface. So it wasn't echoing around like you get in a room with lots of
texture.
Reflections. Yeah, there weren't lots of reflections because they were all being deflected in all different ways. So that was the great thing about that room, is it just sounded loud. It didn't have any sort of horrible sort of long, nasty stuff in it. I mean, I think one used to EQ out about 300 hertz, which was a sort of rather muddy sort of frequency, and used to take a bit of that out, and it would clean the sound up a bit, but still sound really big. And the big thing was to compress it as much as possible, either using this SSL reverse talkback mic that had a built-in compressor, or I used to use Uri 1176s and just wind them up till it sort of distorted. There was always a good bit of distortion in there. Always helped, you know. Not too much, not like the 995 necessarily, but certainly, you know, overloading stuff definitely has its merits sometimes.
Yeah, like it's not the acoustic sound that you're hearing when you're standing next to the drums.
No.
It's like an overdriven sort of.
Yeah. But one of the things for me recording drums was that, having sort of grown up listening to records in the 70s and 60s to a degree, there was so much sort of dry drum sound on pop records, which is kind of fine for disco stuff or whatever, you know. I mean, that it had its place, but I would get sort of a bit bored of listening to Eagles records, where it was rather very dry drum sound. And I thought, well, I bet it doesn't sound like that if you're standing next to the drum kit, you know. So my thing, and especially with the sort of punk or post-punk thing, when everybody was trying to rebel against that sort of, you know, the Eagles sort of sound and music and stuff. I wanted it to sound like when you're standing next to somebody thrashing away on a drum kit, it's bloody loud, you know, and I wanted to try and make it sound loud on tape, even when the volume was right down, if you see what I mean. So the you know, the building that room in London at the Townhouse was, you know, it was real sort of manna from heaven in a way, and great that we were allowed to do that. And of course it set off a trend. But the other thing was that the studio had two areas to it. The other area was you know, much more conventional, because you couldn't have that sound on everything, you know. I mean, you know, vocals in there sounded too echoey unless you really put gobos around it and everything.
Did you do anything else in that room?
Well, some things, yeah. I've got a feeling we did the marimbas of Morris Pert's marimbas in there, I think, but we might have, you know, you could put carpet down on the floor and use, do you call them gobos in America? Yes. But, you know, screens or whatever. So you could, baffles, yeah, you could baffle it down a bit for sure. So yeah, we did used to do other things in there. Percussion was nice and that sort of thing. Close mic'd electric guitars were fine, and, you know, with a room mic as well, maybe, depending on what you were doing. So yeah, it used to get used a lot. It really annoyed me back in, I guess it was the early 2000s, they decided that the powers that be there decided, when it had been bought by EMI, I think, that the Stone Room's a bit passé now, and they pulled it down and redesigned it so that so they made the control room much bigger and went into what was the Stone Room and totally ruined it, basically. That's usually what happens. People think they know best and bugger it all up.
The Magic Shop is gone. So
has it?
Yeah. A lot of these places are, as you know, they're gone.
Most have. I worked in a great studio in New York, right down near Canal Street. I've forgotten what it was called. And the guy who owned it was really into spiders and things like that. So he had all these. He had it in the kitchen area, or the rec area and stuff, was all these big. I wish I could remember the name of the studio. I'm sure you would know it, but it was just off Broadway before it got to, or even West Broadway just before it got down to Canal Street. Anyway, I worked in lots of great studios in New York. I used to work a lot at Right Track.
Yeah. Did you ever work at Sound on Sound?
No, I'm not sure I worked on Sound on Sound. Where was that?
The 40s in Midtown.
Okay. And the Power Station and
Avatar.
It's Avatar now. It was the power station then. Yeah. That's where they did Let's Dance and stuff. Well, I mean, lots and lots of stuff was done there. But no, there was a great studio vibe in New York, really.
Yeah, there was RCA on 44th, which was where Toscanini did all those orchestral broadcasts.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I got to do a few records in there. One, I was playing drums with Cecil Taylor on an A&M record. And then I did a solo percussion record there. I did a few. And then a few years later, the IRS foreclosed on property.
Oh, God.
IRS building.
Yeah. Oh, God.
And those were all beautiful wooden rooms with wall baffling that you could adjust.
Yeah.
You know, orchestral size room. There were chamber rooms. It was 3 different rooms. Incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So you could set up a solo snare drum or solo marimba in the room, and it would just set up mics, and it would be perfect. Set up some noise.
Really? Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
And I did an album, the first album, with a band called The Fall.
Oh yeah.
Michael Bean. I did that in 1982 at the Manor Studios, and in other words, we're talking before CDs. It was never released on a CD. It only ever came out on vinyl, and it's not on Spotify. And it's like all the record companies, they must have just taken everything, or virtually everything, because presumably even stuff done in the 60s had already been, you know, whether you're talking Miles Davis, A Kind of Blue, I bet what ends up on Spotify is probably from a CD or something. I don't know enough about it, but all I know is that our Kansas Traveller, Michelle Shocked, and The Fall were both Mercury. I think they were Mercury, the label. And you can't, they're not on Spotify. And yet it was their first album that, I'm not saying it was great because I did it, but it was a seminal album. And it's not there. And it should be.
It's elsewhere. I mean, Spotify is kind of a question mark anyway, in terms of who wants to be there, who doesn't want to be there.
Well, I mean, even the famous people like Floyd, who wouldn't put Dark Side of the Moon on it to start with, eventually did, or have done. I mean, there's not usually much that I can't find on Spotify if I'm trying to find something. Not my. I mean, I'm talking somebody else's music, not anything I've done. But it's just interesting when you find things that you know aren't there that ought to be. But you know, when Spotify and streaming first came out, literally the first day it came out, I said to myself and to anybody else who was listening, this is the future. It was so obvious to me, having been through as soon as iTunes came out and you could just cherry pick songs to buy, and then Napster came out when the whole generation of kids stole it. When streaming arrived, that was a relatively affordable, you know, monthly payment. I just knew that would be the future for as long as until something else comes along. So obvious to me.
I use it a lot. I've used it to increase my contemporary classical music, you know, listening, because I've collected CDs forever, but you know, classical CDs are hard to come by. But you know, anything by Debussy's up there, you know, anything by Stockhausen's up there. It's pretty
remarkable. Yeah. Well, I never really liked CDs, and the first thing I did when iTunes came out, and the iPod, I literally took every single CD that I liked, because of course you were given loads by record companies or whatever that you either didn't ever want to listen to or never listen to again. So I put anything I liked into my library years ago, and my CDs sit in a garage up in London somewhere, whereas I've got all my vinyl collection is down here, and with a nice deck and setup. Not that I sit there that often and play, but I have got a proper hi-fi setup, and I don't want to play. I've anything CD wise, I've just got in my iTunes library. But 90% of I've done lots of comparisons of listening to CDs where I actually think, because I've got a decent DAC on my computer here, so I'm not, I've got a reasonably decent output from the computer, and I've done, because I've done so many interviews the last year, I've done comparisons to, for instance, Synchronicity on my CD does not sound as good as Synchronicity on coming off Spotify. And some sound better on Spotify than they do on Apple, and some sound, because I've got Apple Music as well as Spotify. I thought Amazon, having 3 is too many, but because mostly they're the same thing on them, but they do sound different on different systems. And I think sometimes CDs were very badly made from.
Well, they were bad transfers to begin with, yes?
That's what I mean. The bad transfer. Some secretary in the office probably couldn't find the master tape, so safety master will do, and all that stuff.
Yeah, you can tell. In fact, it's funny that the Lost Trident sessions from Mahavishnu, which never came out in the day, when they put it out, they just put out the 2-track safety, and it sounds like a crap. So, then a year later, they found the masters.
Oh, God.
Right? So, anytime they say, this is my concern about Mummer and English Settlement, when Andy and Dave have told me that the masters are missing.
Yeah.
That they could show up. I don't know how, but we hold out hope.
You see, I have a problem. I must go in a minute, but I have a problem that I think on the CD of English Settlement, the vocals sound too low in the mix to me. And yet, if I play the vinyl album, it sounds better. And I don't understand why.
Well, I have it here. So this is a Caroline.
That looks like a single, though.
No, it's the full CD, but.
Oh, that's a CD. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a CD, but it's a Caroline record.
Well, Caroline was the Virgin imprint in America, but it was originally more of a reggae label. But it was released in America as a single album, whereas in the UK it was a double album.
Double vinyl.
Double vinyl, but in one sleeve in England. But in America, it was only one album, and I can't remember what tracks they left off.
Oh.
Or if they did leave them off. You see, I don't know. I need to do more investigation, because obviously the reason we released it as a double vinyl in England was because of I used to say I don't want to cut more than 22 minutes on a side. Because it's going to sound too low in volume and not good, sonically.
No bottom.
Yeah, and then especially the tracks towards the middle. It's why I used to put sort of soft things on the tracks towards the middle or whatever. I mean, that's a whole nother discussion, talking about album orders and things like that. But anyway.
Okay.
I could talk for hours like Andy, probably.
And I would listen. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Lovely to chat.
Lovely. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.